In the continued aftermath of the Ukraine drone strike deep inside of Russia on their strategic bomber fleet, we're still trying to find out exactly what happened. What are the consequences? What is the relationship with this and the peace talks that are going on in Istanbul or that did happen in the immediate aftermath? And then where things are going now. Part of the question that we also have to answer is, how did Ukraine do this? Is this some spectacular Ukraine-only operation that took care of this? Was it, as some say, it was the British, the MI6 that was doing it? Or others are actually saying, no, the U.S. CIA also had some involvement here. It's going to be hard to parse some of this stuff, but we're going to talk to somebody today who has a pretty good idea about how some of these things work. And that is a first-time guest on our show, John Kiriakou, former CIA intel analyst and operations officer and CIA whistleblower. First of all, John, a delight to have you on the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's so much fun. And I'm sorry that it's been so long since we've seen each other.
Yeah, it has. We were talking just before we came on air here, and it was actually a baseball game at Washington Nationals in 2019 that we had during the championship run. So it was the last of the heyday. So that was a good time at the park. Not quite as good now, but anyway, that was good. Well, listen, a lot of people don't know who you are because it's the first time you've been on our show, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit, because you've always been kind of a hero of mine because of the courage that you took in the past. When some people know on our channel anyway that I did some whistleblowing stuff in 2012 with the Afghanistan war, but that has been like about 4% of the courage it took you, because it cost you something really serious. And I wonder if you could just kind of tell briefly about your story.
Thank you. Well, I spent almost 15 years with the CIA, and then went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff as the senior investigator. But after I left the CIA, I blew the whistle on the agency's torture program. To make a very long story very short, the Obama administration came after me, charged me with 5 felonies. I was finally forced to take a plea to violating an obscure law, only the second American ever charged with violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. And I did 23 months in a federal prison. Zero regrets. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had the opportunity and the necessity for doing it. But here we are. We find ourselves whistleblowers outside looking in.
Well, but let's get to that. I mean, what is it that you discovered? And what did you do, first of all, within the system?
Right. I was the chief of CIA counterterrorism operations in Pakistan, and I led a series of raids that resulted in the capture of somebody named Abu Zubaydah, who we believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. Abu Zubaydah was turned over to a secret CIA team, taken to a secret prison, and he was tortured mercilessly. He was the first one of our high-value targets to be tortured. And the CIA did things that were not approved by the Justice Department, not approved by the president. The torture extended to other prisoners, at least 14 that we know of. Several were killed during the torture sessions. And so I went on ABC News and I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. And I said that the torture had been personally approved by the president. Now, oddly, interestingly, the Bush administration never charged me with a crime. In fact, they closed the case against me, concluding that I had not committed a crime. But the Obama administration secretly reopened the case, charged me with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. I have 5 kids at home. And so I'm looking at 45 years. They offered me 30 months. I'd served 23. I took the deal.
And that is a profound price. And what was the reason that the Obama administration came after you when the Bush administration, against whom you directly accused, didn't?
Right. Well, the reasons really are severalfold. Number one, I had a real and dangerous enemy in John Brennan. At the time, Brennan was the Deputy National Security Advisor. Of course, he went on to be the CIA Director. Brennan and I, we've known each other for 35 years. We've always hated each other. Brennan was one of the godfathers of the torture program. So he had it out for me for going public. He said that I had aired the CIA's dirty laundry in public. And Barack Obama, let's face it, Barack Obama had a Nixonian obsession with national security leaks. Between 1917, when the Espionage Act was passed into law, and 2009, 3 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. Just under Barack Obama, 8 people were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. I think that says it all right there.
Yeah, well, God bless you for doing that, because without that, we would never know. And what has always troubled me, and I can only imagine for you, is that, Brennan had flat out lied in bald face that we don't do that. That's not American policy, et cetera. And then even confronted with it, actually with a number of things that were later proven to be completely bald-faced lies. I think that the Snowden leak revealed some other things that had been, and he didn't serve 23 months in a federal prison.
No, he got rich.
Yeah,
and he got rich.
Love to see that come to justice one day. And just like he seemed to wait around for you, we'll see if maybe in the future somebody else wants to bring some justice. Love to see.
I'm hopeful. But, and I think if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be this president right now.
Well, I'd like to see this president give you a pardon, is what I'd like to see right off the bat. So get that off the table.
Well, thank you. I applied for one, and I'm hopeful. I've got some really fantastic support in Tucker Carlson, Judge Napolitano, Dr. Phil, the former head of or the current head of the Make America Great Again Foundation, the former U.S. attorney in Utah, who said that my case was the template. These were his words, the template for the Democratic Party's policy of lawfare. And so I'm hopeful that I'll get a fair hearing in the White House. Well,
if it's worth anything at all, add us onto that list, because we are in your corner as well.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that you have done. Well, let's get into what's going on right now in the U.S. Sphere, or at least in the way that we're associated with what's going on, because as people are aware, certainly who've been watching our show here, that there was a big high-profile attack inside of Russia on some of their strategic bomber fleet. Gary's showing you some of that video there. Just in terms of the operation itself, it was reported that it was 18 months in the planning. Lots of really high-tech, high statecraft, or spycraft, I guess is probably a better term, operations. Right. They never were discovered. They conducted this all the way through, got it into deep inside of enemy territory, et cetera. But now that in the aftermath, there's some questions about how did Ukraine pull it off? If you ask Volodymyr Zelensky, he's pretty clear where it happened.
Europe, together with America, has better weapons than Russia. We also have stronger tactical solutions. Our Operation Spiderweb yesterday proved that. Russia must feel what its losses mean. That is what will push it toward diplomacy. And when Russia takes losses in this war, it's obvious to everyone that Ukraine is the one holding the line, not just for itself, but for all of Europe.
So some have interpreted that to mean, yeah, and in fact, we were doing this with Europe, not only for Europe, and we had some help in that. What is just your assessment from the outside about, and actually, let me ask you 2 separate questions. First of all, just in terms of the execution of this operation, how do you view it as someone who's formerly in the CIA?
This was a brilliant operation. Brilliant. Whether you favor the Ukrainians or favor the Russians, a whole lot of planning went into the successful execution of this operation. You think of it this way. This had to be, well, actually, the Ukrainians said this was 18 months in the making. So not only did they have to smuggle these drones across the border into Russia, they had to cross all 11 time zones and get them pre-positioned. You have to do that with human beings. So this is a clandestine activity, what we at the CIA used to call an operational act. But it's multiple operational acts to get these things in place and ready to launch, and then have the whole thing commanded from Kyiv. Very, very impressive operation. Now, I'm going to disagree with President Zelensky in that the only people who do these kinds of large-scale operations and then don't tell anybody about it are the Israelis. And most of the time, the Israelis do inform us either minutes before the operations are launched or as the operations are being launched. There is no possible way, there is no possible scenario by which the Ukrainians didn't either inform the Americans and other Western allies that this operation was in play, or didn't have the Americans and possibly the Brits helping them to do this operation. There are too many moving parts. It's just too complicated. They couldn't do it on their own.
So what do you say to those that say, no, this is just how good the SBU is? They can get that done. What does it lead you to believe it had to be either the help with somebody else or that they would have said something?
Well, you're going to need things like imagery, for example. You're going to need things like logistical assistance. You can't do everything yourself. Not when you're a small country at war against a giant nuclear power. You have to have some kind of help. And if you're the United States providing billions and billions of dollars in aid, then by God, you want to be consulted about these things. You don't want to read about these operations on the front page of the Post or the Times. That's just not the way it's done in that world.
In fact, on that point, what does it tell you that, at least as of the last time I checked earlier this afternoon, Trump had not made any comments about this, which I found a little unusual because he loves to comment on everything here. And when specifically asked, Caroline Leavitt yesterday afternoon was specifically asked about the United States and what we thought of it and what the president thought about it. And she said, I'll let the president answer for himself. And so what do you make of his silence on this?
His silence tells me that we were in on it. If we had been cut out, he would be furious and maybe even a little bit embarrassed. And he would have been just beating Volodymyr Zelensky about the face and head in the media. And he hasn't been. He's been silent. And to me, that says that that we were at least consulted and that this was possibly a joint operation, because his silence just, protects the operation. It protects the relationship, sources and methods, as we used to say at the agency. So I would think that if we had been cut out, if the president had been embarrassed by not being consulted, he would be jumping up and down in front of TV cameras today and yesterday, and that hasn't been the case.
And you're just kind of in the larger, I guess, world where all this stuff is going on here. The president about a week or so ago was just blasting the Russians because they were firing missiles and drones, et cetera, into Kiev. They were in Odessa. They were having a lot of actions down there, et cetera. But then, number one, he didn't say anything about the Ukrainian missiles and drones that were going in the other direction, even during that time. And now hasn't said anything here. I'm unclear what his play is here, because on the one hand, it's like he's trying to shame Russia, but you can't shame Russia. They can't be shamed into this.
No, they can't.
But then sometimes he's also had harsh words to say about Zelensky as well. So what is your take on what the president is actually trying to get accomplished here?
Well, Danny, I think he's very serious about wanting to get the two sides to the negotiating table in Istanbul. He has said repeatedly that he's willing to make the trip if it will make a peace deal more likely to be approved or even to be negotiated in the first place. And the Ukrainians say, fine, that's great. The Russians say it's not necessary yet. There is no peace deal, so let them work out some of these details first. You're right that the Russians cannot be shamed. And I think he understands that. He's already been president for 4.5 years. So I think he understands the Russian mindset. I think he understands Vladimir Putin. At the same time, I also think that the president really believed that he could use the bully pulpit to push the two sides together. And he's been stiff-armed by Vladimir Putin. He doesn't appreciate being stiff-armed. So I think that allowing these Ukrainian offensive operations to go forward is one way in which the Trump administration can try to nudge the Russians to the negotiating table. You remember, I mean, we were kids, you and I, when this was happening, but I'm sure you've studied it. When the U.S. and the North Vietnamese began to negotiate peace in the Paris peace talks, peace during the Vietnam War, right. That's when some of the fiercest fighting took place. And it's because both sides wanted to get a leg up that they could then negotiate away in Paris. And I wouldn't be surprised if both the Russians and the Ukrainians have come to that conclusion here, that maybe you step up operations now, and then you can negotiate it away later in Istanbul.
But it's a complicated, because you mentioned that President Trump doesn't like to be stiff-armed by Vladimir Putin, but he's kind of being stiff-armed by Zelensky as well. As a matter of fact, so this is the second direct conversation between Russia and Ukraine, of course, in Istanbul. Here is the lead delegate for the Ukraine side, Umarov, and coming out talking about what they want to accomplish. And as you do, this kind of sounds like that Umarov thinks he's on the upper end of the power dynamic, and doesn't at all sound like they're getting close to a peace settlement.
We've been telling Russia for a very long time, this war must end. And the whole world supports us in that. We're calling for real work to end this war. The first necessary steps are clear to everyone: a ceasefire, humanitarian actions, and preparation for a leaders' meeting. If Russia is serious about ending the war, it will move forward on this. If not, international sanctions must follow.
Okay, so obviously Russia is not going to do a ceasefire first. They've said that emphatically from day one. Have never said anything different. So Umarov knows for sure that that's not going to get done there. And then if they don't, then we're going to sanctions. So is this an attempt, and I've heard some people suggest that it is, for the Ukraine side not to stiff-arm Trump, but to try and coerce Trump into going back on trying to find a settlement, and to instead getting back on their train with sanctions?
Oh, I think absolutely yes. You know, we shouldn't underestimate Volodymyr Zelensky. He's not an idiot. Sometimes we like to portray him as one, but he really isn't. And with the Brits, the French, the Germans, the Poles, and a whole bunch of other allies quietly pushing Trump to keep up those Biden-era programs, aid programs, military aid programs to Ukraine, I think that Zelensky probably has concluded that Trump can be manipulated, at least in the short term. If the fighting is still as serious as it is, with dozens of people being killed every day on both sides, it allows Zelensky to then go back to Trump and say, you see, I would love to have peace, but the Russians are such ogres. They're killing our people. They're firing rockets at civilian areas. They're hitting apartment buildings and parks and hospitals. The Brits and French and Germans are with us. We know that you want to be with us too. That argument might have a little bit of weight right now.
And you know who else says it wants to pile on to that? There's a whole group of people in the U.S. led by Richard Blumenthal, and Lindsey Graham. And
that's right.
Gary, if you can pull this one up out of the archives here, Jack Keane was also pretty emphatic earlier today.
So the leverage has got to be, I think, number one, military assistance, and give them the robust air defense systems and the other things they desperately need. Why is that? Because once Putin sees that the United States is still committed to Ukraine, he knows he can't achieve victory. The evidence is already right in front of us. We're 39 months into the war, Maria. 39 long months. That's how much time it took for us to defeat Nazi Germany. And Putin has not succeeded. He hasn't even taken the entire Donbass region, which is what he wanted to take in 2014. So he cannot succeed if the United States is providing military assistance. He knows that for a fact. Second thing, let's issue the crippling sanctions. That is all part of the process.
Yeah, there you go with those crippling sanctions again. But John, I got to ask you, we've had now nearly 3.5 years of crippling sanctions, and it has had the opposite effect. Russia's economy is stronger than it was, not weaker. Ours is weaker than it was, not stronger. Yes. And Russia keeps going forward on the battlefield. So come on, man, what gives?
Yeah, Danny, if there has ever been a lesson for the United States on sanctions, it has been this conflict. The Russians have not been harmed by sanctions, not in any way. There are gigantic Russian markets available in China, in India, all over the rest of the world. And the Russians have had no problem at all selling their oil and their natural gas and anything else they want to sell. Most of the world does not have sanctions on Russia. So we can sanction Russia from now until kingdom come. It's not going to harm them in any way. Just like in Iran, the Iranians lack for nothing. Nothing. They don't need us. They don't need Wall Street. They don't need American investment. They have Russian and Chinese investment and others. So this ought to be a lesson to the United States that sanctions don't work. If anything, they harm only the poorest and most vulnerable in the target country. We need to do something else. Oh, I have an idea, like maybe negotiations. We used to joke when I was in the CIA. We used to joke about the George W. Bush administration and how we had never seen anybody work so hard to not talk to our enemies. The situation was the same under Joe Biden. It's hard to think back on an administration where they worked so hard to not talk to our enemies. So maybe if we talk to them and let the diplomats do what they're being paid to do, we might accomplish something that sanctions have been unable to accomplish.
Now, let me ask you a question here kind of related to that in terms of, especially back to the decision maker in the United States of President Trump. One wonders how much accurate information he's being given by, I mean, let's just say the CIA, since that's what you have some experience with, in accurately assessing what the balance of power between the two sides is in all the areas you're talking about: logistics, diplomatic, manpower, etc. Everything that goes into what makes a nation state have the power to fight and win a war. And obviously it's off the charts in the favor of the Russian side. But sometimes I get the idea that Trump hears things like, well, let me give you an example. So the UN ambassador for Russia, Ambassador Nebenzia, went on the UN Security Council just a couple of days ago and said that, hey, by the way, we'd love to do diplomacy, but if not, Gary, if you could play that. Hang on, sorry, Gary, if you could play Nebenzia.
As long as Kyiv tries to prolong the war and provoke Russia by striking residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, we will continue our special military operation and destroy objects associated with the military potential of the Kyiv regime. And no new anti-Russian sanctions, arms supplies to Ukraine, or other hostile steps towards Russia will prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The choice is now up to Ukraine. Peace as a result of negotiations or inevitable defeat on the battlefield with different conditions for ending the conflict.
So you could say, if you're Trump, you say, all right, I got Zelensky here talking that they're going to win and they just need all this support here and that they can turn the tide, et cetera. And then I got the Russian side over here with Nebenzia in this case saying that, no, we're either going to take what we want on negotiations with this 12-point plan they put out, which is basically terms of surrender, or we're going to win on the battlefield. Now, Trump, just looking at the two of this, and any American for that matter, can go, well, they're both just, grandstanding, et cetera. But if you look at the power dynamics behind, one can back up the words and one can't. So if that was the case, then you would not want to play a general. They're trying to balance the things out, but you would tell this side, dude, you guys got to get off the table here, or get off your butt and get to the table, or I'm going to walk. I mean, how do you see that part?
Yeah, I have to agree with you. One of the things, too, that we're not talking about, and when I say we, I mean Americans and especially American policymakers, is that the Russians have a virtually unlimited supply of ground troops that they can just throw into the meat grinder. Not just Russians, and there have been huge losses on the Russian side, and that's because of Russian military strategy, but North Koreans and Belarusians, and some reports indicating Chinese who have volunteered to go to Russia or go to the front lines and fight on behalf of Russia. Ukraine is a much smaller country. They can't keep this up forever. The Russians can't keep it up forever, and Russia is a nuclear power. So I'm going to make a guess here, or make a prediction. It's not going to be very bold or creative, but what we're going to see in the end is that the Russians keep the disputed territories, the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson. They're going to keep Crimea. Ukraine will never, ever be a member of NATO. They'll likely join the European Union eventually, maybe even on a fast track. But I think that the Russians are going to get 90% of what they want. The one thing they might not get is probably the least important. and that's what the Russians are calling denazification of the Ukrainian regime. The Ukrainians always argue that there are no Nazis. There may be a handful of neo-Nazis, but not in any positions of power. I think the Russians repeat that for propaganda purposes. I think they'll probably be willing to negotiate it away.
But what would they have to get in order to negotiate that bait? Because it seems to me like one of the biggest difficulties for the Ukraine side is, and Zelensky so far been categorically against this, is that they would have to withdraw from significant portions of the southern three of those territories and agree to give that up and agree to some kind of demilitarization. Or according to what Nebenzia said in additional comments, they're going to keep fighting until they get it one way or the other. Those are big asks. Those
are big asks, and those are unacceptable for the Ukrainians. I think that's going to be one of those things on the negotiating table that the both sides are going to be stuck on. It's going to require a lot of patience and a lot of talk. But that's okay.
Back to that power dynamics, though. But the Russians don't have to give in, right? I mean, they can just do that, keep fighting, and then they're going to lose it one way or the other. I mean, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
Do you see it any different?
No, I think you're exactly right. The only thing that the Ukrainians have going for them on this issue is that the Russians have no interest in occupying Ukraine. They have no interest in occupying Kyiv, right? They're only interested in those areas of eastern and southern Ukraine that are ethnically Russian, where people speak Russian, and for the most part, they want to be a part of Russia. They're not, I don't think there's any danger that the Russians are going to take the whole of the country and push all the way to the border of Poland. That's not what the Russians are interested in. So I think that the Russians
and actually
have
one of the 12 points was that they wanted the change in the laws on the Ukraine side that would protect, that one right there, that would protect all the full protection of rights, freedoms, and official language status for the Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine. And that actually harkens back to the Minsk agreements, which the Russians complained was never put into effect. That was one of the key parts of the Ukraine obligations under the Minsk that was never executed, which the Russians say was one of the big problems here, which they will now insist upon with this 12-point peace proposal. So the question is to you, where do you see this going? Because you have these, categorical rejections of those key components on the Ukraine side, the threat and the promise, rather, that Russia will keep fighting if they don't get them. Where does this go, and where does that leave President Trump?
Well, I think that this upcoming meeting in Istanbul already has failed before it started. I don't think President Trump's going to go to Istanbul. He mentioned again this morning that he's willing to go. He's willing to bring the two sides together. He's not going to go because they're not even close enough to be willing to sit at the same table. So I think that this is a loss. I think the fighting is going to continue. It's going to be ugly because the weather is good and it's warmed up. So it's much easier to maneuver. It's much easier to keep fighting and pushing. So I think we're going to keep going through this for weeks, maybe for months, before there are real and substantive meetings about trying to wind things down.
And what if, I guess, in the intervening period, because especially in the northern part of this new front that Putin has opened up in the Sumy area, they're starting to make some pretty big chunks. In pretty rapid succession. So especially along with the pressure on the unrelenting pressure on the entire eastern front, and even a little bit in the northern part with Kupiansk and Kharkiv areas, it's not clear that the Ukraine army can continue to hold out against that. That 2 months from now they would be in even as good a position as they're in right now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I used to have a radio show every day on Sputnik, and I had a TV show on RT. So in the interest of transparency, I used to work for the Russians quite happily, and I'm still a member of these listservs that they have. So they're constantly talking about these issues, and this situation in Sumy, I think, has surprised a lot of Russians with the relative ease with which the Russian military has been able to move. And I think that that's a message to the Russian leadership that the Ukrainians are under more pressure than they're admitting to in public, and that if the Russians keep up the pressure, even if they're not making huge strides, they can put enough pressure on the Ukrainian government that it's the Ukrainians who then demand to go to the negotiating table. not the Americans, but the Ukrainians, because they're just not going to be able to take it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's historically. You mentioned the Paris meetings in the Vietnam War, or the Korean negotiations to get to the armistice. I mean, that's kind of how it was with that. Until the pain level got up high enough for one or both parties, there wasn't going to be any decisions made. But when it did, that's what finally drove them to negotiate it. And we'll see how this one works out.
Yes.
Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on today. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure.
We'll have to get together on another baseball game pretty soon. And,
I can't wait. I can't wait. Looking forward to it.
That'll be great. Thanks ever so much. And we appreciate you guys being with us today. And we will see you on tomorrow on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.